wake up with the sun and struggle through the day. In every passing moment, watch your life.
All right, what's up, guys? I'm going to go strong on this one, so I hope you guys brought your seatbelts and packed the lunch, because I'm going to go hard on this. I'm going to see how it goes, but I'm going to try to cram my entire worldview, at least a summarized version of it, into a single podcast, and we're going to see how this is going to go. It's 11:40. I've had a couple glasses of wine. Should be a lot of fun. So here we go. So the current state of the human condition and of the world is that we are a confused species right now. We're out of touch with nature and with spirit. We spend too much time in cubicles, too much time in cars, sitting behind desks and chairs. We're sitting in a poor posture in a way that our body's not meant to be sitting on a 12-hour basis every single day. And by and large, we're not getting enough exercise, and we're eating very, very poorly. Now, we're eating poorly, and that makes us make bad decisions, and it puts us into a state of constant emotional stress and anxiety, and it puts us into poor physical health too. So we have cancer rates going crazy out of control like never before, autism like crazy, just stress and anxiety, heart disease, all kinds of things that you can think of. Everything's terrible. So out of touch with eating properly. We're dehydrated, which I personally think leads to a lot of cancers by making your body a poor conductor of electricity. We're out of touch with our spirit, because spirit has sort of been monopolized by religious institutions, which is something I'll get to here shortly. But we've lost touch with the understanding of metaphysical terms and just talking about spirit and talking about spiritual things in ways that we can all measure and quantify and understand and put into frame into a conversation. Now, this is due largely to like an outrageously commercialized culture, right? So we're sitting in these office buildings, in square offices with square ceiling tiles and square floor tiles, with a square desk and a square whiteboard and a square computer screen, and all of these straight line masculine left brain things. So our brains begin to become more and more left-brained, and the more left-brained we become, the more we design things in these cubic sort of shapes. And so it's one of these spirals that I'm always talking about, where one problem feeds into a result, which feeds into an exacerbation of the problem. So we live in these really unnatural situations, but it's done because we can make the money that we need to make to fulfill cultural expectations when we do that. So we can drive nicer cars and have a nicer house and all this type of thing. So we have this outrageously commercialized sort of culture where it's last about you and taking care of your people, and it's more about having the things that you need to have to fulfill a cultural expectation, or to make more money to have that stuff. And in most cases, even as parents and spouses, we think that we need to provide those material things for our spouse or for our kids. So we become disconnected from the realization that even though we're being selfless and we ourselves are not necessarily being materialistic, we are feeding a materialistic problem within the culture, and we're acting out of accordance with our own nature. So what does all this do? This leads to very, not just poor physical health, but poor emotional and psychological and spiritual health too. So we make bad decisions. We walk around in a state of anxiety, in a state of panic. We're always trying to make deadlines that don't really make sense for us. We're trying to fulfill obligations that are not aligned with our natural system of values, right? So we get stressed, we become unmindful, and we're not mindful of our emotions. We're in a place where, as a society, if you talk about meditation, I mean, these days the New Age movement's kind of gaining traction, so it's not so bad. But being a hippie or being some spiritual person has not always been easy. So it just puts us in a really imbalanced state of mind. We make bad decisions, and we perpetuate these negative cycles in our lives. So we raise kids who are happy with a job that they're not in love with. As long as they're making the money they want to make, that they saw their parents make, they follow in their parents' footsteps. So we're perpetuating these negative cycles, and that's maybe on the good end. Now this is exacerbated. All the stress and all this stuff affects how we parent our kids and how we interact in our relationships, and this just spirals out to everything else that we do. So first and foremost, we're a very confused species on this planet, certainly a very confused civilization in America today. Really, this is a global problem, but it starts at the individual level. But I happen to think that if we work together, that an answer can be found. And it all starts by looking within. Now, where does this culture come from? We have two major institutions on Earth. We have the scientific institution, which is really just a big conglomerate of all the scientific universities around the world that all seem to have sort of similar agendas and similar ideas of how we got here and what we're trying to do. Cutting edge science is one thing. We all know that there are big innovations in science and technology. That stuff happens. The more material it is, I think the more focused on the material, on matter it is, the physical sciences and stuff like that, the more innovation we tend to have. It's in the material sciences. But we're not really looking at metaphysics and stuff like that the way that the great philosophers of the past were. And this is obviously a problem. So we have the religious people that are handling the metaphysical stuff. Anything physical is science. Anything metaphysical is religious. Now you're putting your hands, or you're putting your spiritual health and your spiritual leadership of the entire planet into the hands of our religious institutions. And so just to look at, for instance, obviously the Catholic Church is rife with pedophilia charges around the world. They spend billions of dollars a year, on just fighting pedophilia claims in court or keeping people quiet from talking about this stuff. This is institutionalized evil at the highest level. These guys are running the show, and I won't get into the history of the Catholic Church right now, but this is something I feel very strongly about, and I think that if you have an education on it, about any of the monotheistic religions, you would understand where I'm coming from. So you basically have the scientific institution on one hand, covering all the left brain people, all the left brain concepts and ideas, all the left brain thinking and innovation, and then you have the religious institutions handling all the right brain concepts and innovation and leadership there. So these are two very broken institutions, right? Religion most assuredly, but also the scientific institution of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and getting rid of some things over the course of the last 400 years or so that probably shouldn't have gone away, which we'll get into as well. But there are irreconcilable differences between these two, right? Science makes certain claims that are fact claims based on a left-brain materialist, empiricist sort of point of view. Religion makes claims that are entirely subjective and spiritual and in many cases totally fly in the face of the laws of physics. But we can't reconcile the two because we have no one thinking in a balanced way that's trying to quantify and bridge gaps, build bridges of understanding between the two, between the left brain establishments and the right brain establishments that are leading the world today. And now this causes a head-to-head conflict. This goes back centuries, about 400 years ago, back to when Francis Bacon formulated the scientific method originally and said, this is how you do science. This created a lot of ripples and stuff we won't get into now, but this changed the way that science was done, and you don't really hear about the philosophers like Ptolemy and Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and Chrysippus and stuff after this point. I mean, at this point, Lawrence Krauss, the cosmologist and astrophysicist, I think from ASU, who's a guy that I used to really like a lot, and now I'm not totally in love with, but he said basically that philosophy is just out of date, like it's obsolete, and that now the physical sciences have taken over. Philosophers just like to sit around and think about how shit works, and the scientists are really doing the good work. I think that's pretty arrogant of him to say that. I would love to hear him talk to Aristotle about that, because I'm pretty sure he would look like a little child talking to someone with that kind of a brain. But this is where we're at as a global community. We have religion on one hand and science on the other. Forgive me, guys. I'm reading through notes here because it's a lot to cover. So first of all, on religions, look, guys, let me just be clear about this. All religions come from the same root. I'm not just saying that. It's not just BS that I repeated from reading on a website online. I've read the religious texts. I've read the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. I've read the Quran, the Torah, the Hadith, the Holy Bible. I've read the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Pyramid text, the Edfu Building text, the Enuma Elish. I've got 3 or 4 different books of a compilation of all of the Native American myths in America. I know quite a bit about, quite a bit about the Southeast Asian, like Chinese stuff. I know a little bit about that stuff. But the point is, and even some African myths and stuff like that. The point is, when you go back to all of these different mythologies and religions around the world, they're all sun worship and star worship religions. They just are. And I know that that's hard to hear if you're a religious person. I grew up religious. I get it. It's hard to understand that. It doesn't diminish what you believe. This is the thing you have to understand as a religious person. This reality should not diminish what you believe. It should enforce it and empower it. But that's because it's much more real and much more amazing and much more sensible and logical than anything you were ever taught. And that's one of the most beautiful things about waking up and sort of becoming more conscious of how truth works, is that I have so much more appreciation for all religions than I ever did before. So religions are all founded on the same roots of star worship, sun worship, the three kings and the star prophecy and Jesus and all this stuff. It's all coming back from Dionysus and all these Egyptian pharaohs and Greek philosophers and Greek leaders and stuff and Hercules. All this stuff is all tied together. It sounds crazy, and I'm going fast. You'll have to look into it yourself. I just want you to ask the questions. That is the thing about religions. There's truth in them. They're not all true. It doesn't diminish them. It makes them better. The problem with that is we have scientists on the other side of the fence that are saying this is nonsense. It's all nonsense. Just throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's all pointless. These things just cause hate. They endorse slavery. They endorse beating women and throwing gays off of roofs. There are tribal revisions that have taken place. We have the Book of Saints today with the Catholics. We have the Hadith and the is it the Kabbalah? I can't remember the Jewish thing. I always forget it. But the point is, we know that today we have the primary religious text within each religion, and then we have a sort of a side book that goes along with it that mullahs and rabbis and saints, which are just people, can just add to tribally as they want to, just throw stuff in there. This has happened with every religion. So if the scientific community could get a grip on that, and the religious people could get a grip on the fact that a lot of their stuff is just tribal bullshit that was added in by people who wanted to do whatever they wanted to do at some point in time, then we could start to build bridges of understanding and figure out what the correlations really meant in the numerology and the astrology of it and all this kind of stuff. Because scientists today just cannot reconcile the thousands of coincidences, unanswered questions, and billions of subjective human experiences with their established views of reality and human consciousness. And this is totally the case, because the claim made by science is that religious people, like Christian people, are so arrogant because how dare they believe that they have the one right God and the other 3,000 gods are wrong. Well, I mean, scientists have the same problem going on there. No one ever talks about it, but they're saying that in the last 400 years, let's say 1 billion or 2 or 3 billion people have lived that are total atheists, materialist, empiricist people that don't believe anything happens after death or any of that. Let's just say that there were 3 or 4 billion people. You're saying that those 3 or 4 billion people have an answer that tens of billions of people since the beginning of time didn't have. Like, they were all just uneducated people that had no ability to look inside and think about the way things worked. And they were all fooled by their superstition and ignorance of science. I don't think that makes sense when you look at the cultures that we know existed in Egypt and Greece and lots of other places. So, yeah, science has a problem. Religion has a problem. They're not getting over it. And let's see. Why does all of this matter? Why does it matter what institutions are running things and what they're saying? It matters because we as humans, as a civilization, we live by example. And if we only see what's around us today, we see war and destruction and division and racism and hatred and gang shootings and all kinds of violence and terrible crap and corrupt politicians to the point that we don't even care how corrupt the politicians are, as long as the one that we vote for is slightly less corrupt and the other guy has more stuff for us to bitch about. Like, that is the frequency range of the vibrational frequency range that we're operating within, and this is terrible. But growing up, I know that I heard from people in my family that, hey, this is how it's always been, right? This is just, people are crappy, it just happens. But here's the thing: the reality is we have a shitty modern example of how to live as a human race, as a species, as people and as individuals, and we can operate within that range. But if we realized a very important truth, that could all change. And the truth is that we have, in past civilizations, we have had very advanced civilizations on this planet who've done some amazing things spiritually, scientifically, and if we understood that, then it would totally change the way that we thought we were capable of being. It totally would change who we think we are, because we do not realize who we are. And that's pretty clear when you look back into our past. So if we knew what we'd done in the past, we'd know what we could be today, and there are control and profit systems in place that do all they can to make sure that we don't make this discovery. This is true when you look at certain scientific institutions like the Smithsonian that have just flagrantly, indisputably covered up evidence of our of different stories of our past that we know happened. We know that they have disposed of remains and things out of the Grand Canyon and all over the world, trying to cover stuff up. So look into that stuff too. Smithsonian cover up. This is important. And obviously we have big oil and gas companies that are trying to cover up lots of remains underground so they can build pipelines on top of things. This happens all the time as well. All right, so in our past are amazing, glorious answers to the problems we face today. And that's why I've been passionate about studying the human story since I was a little kid, is because I've always read stories about these crazy, amazing, beautiful things like Atlantis and all the ancient ruins down in South America and Egypt and Asia and all over the place. And I've come to realize over the last 15 years or so of really deeply researching this stuff that if we looked into it, we could understand some things like how to create clean energy, how to have structures that were built with a perfect harmonic resonance to help us heal or to help us stay well and not develop disease. And what is the impact of having architecture like we have today that's made out of drywall and sheetrock and plastics and weird compound metal alloys and all this weird stuff? There's a lot of things in our lives that we could learn by looking at ancient civilizations like Egypt and the Toltecs and people in South America, and a lot of the lost civilizations that we know we have in the Indus Valley. We look at what they did. They built these beautiful structures. They're appealing to the eyes. They're very aesthetically pleasing. And we're starting to understand in modern science now that these things have a major impact on how we feel whenever we see them. Let's see. Yeah. All right. So let's go back. Let's go back and kind of look at some of that stuff just a little bit and see if there's anything that we can learn. So with ancient civilizations, first of all, understand that we had ancient civilizations long before the beginning of Sumer and Babylon and Ur and Egypt and all that stuff that was like 6,000 years ago, right? Civilizations have at least been back, 20 to 30,000 years. There's a lot of reason to believe they've gone back a lot farther than that. But just even in the last 20 to 30,000 years, we've had technology like probably being able to lift stones using harmonic resonance, using acoustic resonance, using sound waves and sound frequencies that we understood. It's possible that we even had very basic implements like a simple horn made of a certain metal that whenever a ring of people would sing into it, they could levitate a stone. There are a lot of stories of monks even doing this type of stuff today. There are laser cuts in rock all over the earth at quarries in Russia, Egypt, South America. There are insect corners that are cut, like three-dimensional insect corners. Like if you were to cut a cube into a block of stone, that's not something you can do with ancient tools, and yet we find it all over the world. And so we had technology, but not like iPhones, not plastics, not fake substances that are artificial and that are toxic to the environment and that require tens of thousands of underage Chinese kids to manufacture in a sweatshop till they jump out of windows. So when we talk about advanced societies in the past that we could learn from, we're not talking about advanced in the same terms we would talk about today, but we're talking about advanced in terms of they didn't probably understand levitation. They probably had flying machines. They probably had nuclear fission, flying machines that had all kinds of crazy shit. I don't know. But there are some very interesting anomalies that exist when you start looking at ancient civilizations. The sculptures and the stories and the mythology, it starts to get a little bit too weird and a little bit too scientifically eyebrow raising for you to just look over. And so tied in with all of these advanced objects and belief systems and mythologies and stuff that we hear about, is tied into it the root of all monotheism, which is polytheism or paganism. So understand that the importance here is that we understand today we have a material culture, a society of things and stuff and computers and TVs and cars and planes and all that and buildings. We also have religions and we have a spiritual institution. So the same would have been true throughout history. Maybe not in the same big monolithic sense like we had a great big huge Catholic Church and a great big huge scientific establishment, but we have to talk about the religious or spiritual, not religious, but the sort of spiritual condition that people in these advanced civilizations might have been dealing with, because without understanding the spiritual and the material, the spiritual and the physical, you can't understand the human experience. And again, this is what we've lost contact with today. We're not going out in nature. We don't see how things in nature work. And therefore we've lost connection with the spiritual realms that we do inhabit, whether we like it or not. Right? Being happy is a spiritual or emotional state of being. Being miserable, being terrified, being hopeful, these are all spiritual things. Getting out in nature gives you a sense of awe and wonder for the natural. And even according to Einstein, looking into nature helps you understand everything else better. So in these ancient times, when there were these advanced societies, they didn't just randomly decide to build green structures that were harmonically resonated to, the Earth's natural frequency or whatever, they actually had rituals and sort of religious systems around their lives that helped them to reach higher levels of spiritual awakening and help them to understand how to live in harmony better with nature. And it's important to understand that you have to have the religious piece to some extent, not in the form that we have today, but you have, or at least have to have a spiritual piece, not a religious piece. But religions for masses of people do make a huge difference. But here's what they did differently. So what we call paganism today, we tend to think of paganism as a sun-worshipping religion, almost something that when you say paganism, you think that you understand what those people might have been like. They were Celtic or they were Native Americans or pagan. But the reality is most people don't realize that the word pagan is actually a word that came about 2,000 years ago to describe the non-urban people out in the country. So in the Roman Empire, they were purging all the pagan people while they were absorbing all the pagan tribes and their religions and their holidays and all their sun-worshipping events on the calendar, and then taking it as their own and acting like they were doing it all along, which is what they did. They started calling people pagans, and what that meant was bumpkins or hillbillies. That wasn't really a descriptor about their race or their ethnicity or their culture or anything else. It was just they were the bumpkins that were out of town, because in town in these urban centers you had more of the monotheistic religions, or at least you had a more formalized religion around the polytheistic religions, and they were all pretty commercialized to some great extent as well. But they called pagan people, or they called the rural people, the pagan people. If you were outside of town, you were just a pagan. So around the Roman Empire, around 300 AD or so, they just started burning pagans and torching them, and they destroyed the library at Alexandria. But what they were destroying was people who were connected with nature. That's the way you have to look at this. The Roman Empire merged with the Catholic Church in 330 or whatever AD with Constantine and the Pope at the time. And 300 years after Christ, the Catholic Church hijacked a particular sect of the teachings of some man named Jesus of Nazareth, or some group of people at that time in that part of the world, of which I happen to think that Jesus was probably one, and Apollonius of Tyana was another. But there were lots of these guys. But they brought so much truth at the time of Christ that 300 years later, Constantine and the Pope of the Catholic Pope decided to hijack the sect of Christianity that made the most sense to them, that allowed for the greatest amount of control, and Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, that's where the Roman comes from, became the religion of the day. But what they had to do was make it their goal to go wipe out all of the people who understood truth, all of the philosophers, all out in nature, all the guys that understood that all life comes from the sun, that there's a circle of life, that what you put out is what you get back, to be one with nature. And there were powers that came with this. I really do think that there were a lot of sort of psychic powers and stuff that came along with this. But the Catholic Church wanted to wipe these guys out, and so they did. And so you'll see over the last 1,700 years, the Catholic Church has done a pretty remarkable job. They become experts at wiping out tribal people all over the world. And one of the amazing things, as a side note, that I think is awesome, is that even when they got to the Americas, they found the same stories being told, the same mythology being taught that was taught in the old world, the same sort of mystical powers being described. And we'll get into that on some other shows, I'm sure. But ancient civilizations all had this sort of pagan, what we would call a pagan lifestyle. But they understood that the sun, the moon, the stars, the heavenly bodies. It wasn't so much that they had power over us, which is what the scientific people of today really laugh about and ridicule when it comes to paganism and to astrology and stuff. They're just misunderstanding. These ancient people didn't believe that the stars controlled our lives. They believed that as above, so below. They believed that there were cycles in the heavens and there were cycles below, like the seasons and the equinoxes and the precession and all this stuff. This is the thing. It all ties together. They didn't believe that the stars changed anything. I saw Michael Shermer, the famous skeptic, made some comment one day about astrology, and he said, it's the spring equinox or something. You know what that means? It means that just like every other day, the heavens are going to have no impact on your life whatsoever. It's awfully smug and arrogant of him, to make these comments, but, no one's really saying that the stars are doing this to us. It's more that we are microcosms of the macrocosm. And when you look back into ancient theology, you see that left and right in every culture. And everywhere that knowledge goes, there's a renaissance, there's an awakening, there's an advancement in civilization, a great leap in the spiritual and material advancement of a civilization, from the Renaissance back to the Greeks, back to the Egyptians. And every time that knowledge is suppressed, it's usually the church or a monotheistic religion, like the guys in Egypt. I can't remember if it was the Atenists or the Amunists, or I think it was the Atenists. But anyway, it's always the monotheistic religions that come in and fuck everything up and kill everybody and take their culture and their history. So that leads me sort of into that. So monotheism, that brings us almost full circle. Monotheism is the only religion or the only philosophical belief that can, in a higher power, religious belief, that can enable you to control an entire population of people. Or at least it's the most effective method of control for an entire population of people. Because once you're dictating the afterlife to a person, if you can get them to diminish what they do in this life, you can get them to do just about anything to get into the best situation they can for eternity. And this is only logical. Scientifically minded people have a hard time with this, but you have to understand that, A, there is a spiritual component to life, and there are spiritual realms that we inhabit, spiritual forces that are taking place around it. This is very hard for an empirical person to understand, or a scientist. But once you, as a spiritual person, realize that and awaken to that, if you can convince that person that their glory is going to be in heaven for billions and trillions of years, if they'll just do something really shitty for the 20 or 30 or 60 years they're here, it's a logical thing to do. So what we need to do is bridge that gap and build a bridge of understanding to help religious people understand that these religions were all founded out of a template, right? And I won't get into where that template came from, but that's something I'm very interested in and that we will talk about later. But that template was sort of passed down. I think you could, for you guys who know what this is, sort of the Akashic Library, we can get information, downloads, and that information keeps coming out. We're always going to get truth in the numerological and astrological and sort of psychological way. If you look inside, you'll find truth, but the religions always stack stuff on top of it. So bringing that all full circle to today, we have this big monotheistic religion, or the big monotheistic religions that have done what they've done. And we've got this big materialist, empiricist, left-brain scientific movement that has done what it has done. And now we have an ever-growing community of truth seekers, this shamanic philosophy community being one of the fastest growing, I think, in the country. If you were to look at what we're doing or in the world, it's crazy how many more people are getting on board all the time. But Joe Rogan's podcast and guys like Graham Hancock doing amazing work, and everyone out there is looking for a bigger answer. We're looking for more. Even Sam Harris, one of my heroes, who's a very, very left-brain dude, is doing some phenomenal work with his Waking Up podcast, and the name of that podcast says it all right there. But we have this world where there's an irreconcilable conflict between the two major institutions that are running everything. And then we have this sort of third-party existential group of New Age Gnostics that are coming to the front, that are realizing that these cycles exist, and that in the past we've done all these amazing things before, and we're due for another amazing thing now, but it takes an awakening at the individual level. And so the media and the education today are both run by the same powers that are in control, right? By your scientific establishment, by your monotheistic religions, and by the big corporate institutions that exist, that sort of filter money through and get money back from and from those different institutions. So what we need to do as a third-party community of Gnostics is to continue to awaken people, to get together into communities and to form platforms together, and to say that we understand what's going on here. We're going to educate everyone else, and we're going to stop attacking scientific people for being closed-minded. We're going to stop attacking religious people for being closed-minded. And as Gnostics, we're going to start bridging the gap between the left-brain scientific closed-minded people and the right-brain closed-minded people, and start learning. And part of what I'm trying to do here is to create sort of a curriculum for, I think in church, what do we call it? The Romans Road to Salvation? The Romans Road, I think. But start to help people from both far right and far left side to come to the middle and understand that the religions have a lot to offer. There's a lot to be said about practicing thankfulness every single day, even the way you hold your hands. Scientifically has been proven to balance out your bodies and stuff. There's a thing to the chakras. There's a thing to yoga. There's a thing to psychedelics. There's a thing to meditation. And there's definitely a thing about a massive monolithic tax-free entity corporation with billions of people that has been running around for 1,700 years, destroying all knowledge of the past and of esotericism and of the teachings of love and light and truth, the truth being in the spiral. We got to wake up to all this stuff. And that's what we're doing here. I'm so happy to be a part of it. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but thanks for listening. This is kind of an experiment. I wanted to see if I could pull it off. And let me know what you think. Like, subscribe, share, do all that stuff. If you're not on Instagram, check us out on Instagram, shamanic.philosophy. Probably the best program right now to check us out on, or the best platform. And make sure that you share the YouTube videos and stuff. And that's about it, man. I love you guys so much. And hey, may the light be with you. May life be within you. And may you be a sun on the paths of all men. God bless you guys. Go have an awesome week and love on somebody. And I'll see you soon.
We're so distracted now.